And we're live. What's up, everybody? This is a spontaneous stream. The intention of the stream is to talk about yesterday's successful hostage deal, give an analysis of what happened, the good, the bad, and the ugly. On one hand, it was a uh, okay. Anyways, um, in many regards, yesterday was a great day. Right, 4 hostages that have now been in captivity for 8 months have been reunited with their families. Noah Argamani, and she was one of the most high-profile hostages. There's the very popular video of her getting captured. You see the sheer terror in her eyes. So she was one of those released. Another one was Almog Mirjan, Andrei Kozlov, and Shlomi Ziv. Now, a little bit about the rescue operation itself. So officers of the police's elite Yamam counterterrorism unit. Now, Yamam is equivalent to call it like SWAT team, but it's really considered one of Israel's most elite units. It's not part of the military. After the military, you could try out for it, and very few people get in. So they were the main ones involved in the operation, along with the Shin Bet agents, which that's the Israeli equivalent to the FBI. They simultaneously raided 2 Hamas-controlled multi-story buildings in the heart of central Gaza's Nusret refugee camp. Argamani was rescued at one site, while Mirjan, Kozlov, and Ziv were at the second location. Important to note, they were all being held by civilians in civilian family homes. We still haven't heard much from the hostages about what their conditions were like. But on the surface, they all seem in relatively good condition. But again, I don't want to make a judgment yet until we actually hear from them what the past 8 months was like. I mean, without a doubt, it was extremely traumatizing to just have that happen to you. But it's unclear if they were like being abused, tortured, or whatnot, or if they were just had a room to stay in and got food and water and just were hostages. So time will tell exactly the conditions they were kept in. Now, why is this bittersweet? Right, you would think this is great. So it's complicated, really for a few reasons. There's been a deal on the table to release all the hostages since October. Many people don't know this. Since October, weeks after October 7th, Sinwar offered a deal to Israel. We will release all the hostages if you release all the Palestinian prisoners. So that would be getting back 250 hostages in exchange for 8,000 or so Palestinian prisoners. Many would say this is not a fair deal, and I certainly understand that. The consideration would be, yeah, we would get them back alive. We would reunite them with their families. But in releasing that many terrorists, not only is it an injustice to the victims of the families who were harmed by these terrorists, right? Because a lot of these terrorists do have blood on their hands. It also puts dangerous people back out into the world that can ultimately cause more deaths. So many who would oppose such a deal would say, you know what, this short-term gain of getting them back is not worth the long-term impact that it would cause. And I think that's a reasonable position to hold. I personally do think that we need to, this short-term gain, I think it's a sure thing. We know if we could get them back alive, that's a sure thing. And we're speculating on what might happen in the future. So I personally think that if we could guarantee a short-term gain and return the hostages to their families, again, there's a risk, right? I'm not denying that there's no risk, but you're guaranteeing returning people alive rather than speculating that releasing these people will cause more deaths in the future. It might, but there's no guarantee. Now, since we entered Gaza, the deal changed. It wasn't release all the hostages for all the prisoners. It was end the war, right? Leave Gaza, and we will give you back all the hostages for around 2,000 prisoners. I think that's currently what the number's at. So the deal, you could say the deal improved because we entered Gaza. And again, there's a very similar rationale, right? Do we stop fighting Hamas to make sure we get the rest of the hostages back alive, or do we continue to fight Hamas, not return prisoners, but let the hostages die in captivity? Um, it's not an obvious decision, but I'm standing on the side of let's get them back because we know that's a sure thing. We have rescued so far 7 hostages, but around 70 have died in captivity. Right? We've successfully um, rescued 1 for every 10 that died. The longer the war goes on, um, the less hostages will remain alive. Now, another consideration, the idea is, but do we want to release terrorists? I understand that's a challenging decision, but continuing the war creates more terrorists, right? So there's this whole idea that we're like destroying Hamas, and I think that's not really grounded in reality. I think there's probably more terrorists in Gaza now than there were prior to October 7th, because and this is an estimate, we don't know the exact number, but I think a fair estimate is between 30 to 50,000 civilians have been killed. That is literally millions of people who have had severe loss, right? And not a single person in Gaza hasn't lost somebody that they know. I think we're talking about close to 2 to 3% of the Gazan population has been killed. When you get your child killed or your father killed or a family member killed by Israel, you are more inclined to then be a terrorist. So it's unclear that continuing the war actually reduces the amount of terrorists. It very well might just be further radicalizing the Gazan population, creating more terrorists. So I think this is a very important thing to take into consideration. Also, the attack yesterday's rescue mission killed countless civilians. We don't know the exact number. The official number being stated is over 200, but we have seen from past reports that often these numbers are inflated. So I don't know if we could confidently say it was that many, but dozens, potentially 100 plus, I think is a fair estimate. Is that really worth it? So these are all things very much worth considering. Let's take some questions. Mr. Logic says, do we know if the supposed 270 were in the building where the hostages were held? If yes, do they not know the hostages were being held there? It actually seems like one of the areas where a lot of people were killed was a market that was attacked, a nearby market. And it seems like a lot of the firepower was to create a diversion and distraction in order to be able to extract them alive. Um, upon rescuing the hostages, they were under fire, right? Chaos ensued. So Israel shot a lot of firepower into populated areas in order to allow the rescue to be successful. We don't know how many were in the building. Uh, I think it's fair to assume that some of the people in the building knew about it. I mean, the reason Israel successfully released them was intel from Palestinians, right? Palestinians sold this intel to Israelis, so people did know about it. Um, Again, knowing about it and not doing anything about it, I would not say makes you complicit. I think that if you're actively involved in keeping them, then you're complicit. But we can't expect everyday people to take a risky burden upon themselves, and to betray their neighbors. I think it's not. I'm not gonna say it's not a fair expectation. It's just not a realistic expectation. They may have known about it, turned a blind eye, because what are they actually going to do about it? Most people don't feel like they have much power to do something about it. They're not going to release them themselves, and they very well may have seen some strategic benefit to those hostages remaining, right? So it's quite possible that many who lived in the building did know about it and they weren't ideologically opposed to it. That's certainly possible. Maz goes, are they really all terrorists? I think you're talking about the prisoners that are meant to be released. Um, no, I think we could actually speculate that some of them might not. Some of them might not be guilty. I think you have some amount of Palestinian prisoners have not been charged with a crime. They haven't gone to trial. And I think this is a policy that Israel needs to change immediately. We should not hold people in detention without giving them a trial. I think that should be a general rule of thumb. So I think it's fair to assume out of the 8,000 Palestinian prisoners, some amount are innocent. But I would I would assume that the overwhelming majority have been engaged in some kind of terrorist activity, whether they're helped coordinate something or supported or themselves carried out an attack. Farzadi says, should we also have stopped fighting the Nazis to stop Germans from becoming Nazis? I think these are not comparable. We're not talking about conventional warfare where you're fighting the military. We're talking about rooting out a deep rooted ideology that is only perpetuated from our actions. Bombing Germany does not create more Nazis. Bombing Gaza does create more terrorists, so they're very different. It's also not as easy of a war to win. This is an insurgency that the United States fought the Taliban for 20 years and then had nothing to show for it. The strongest military in the history of the world cannot defeat a mountain militia. So I have very little confidence that Israel can actually defeat Hamas. So the question is all this bloodshed actually worth it? Farzadi says, what a patronizing argument. Are Palestinians animals? They can only react with terrorism. Actually, that's certainly no one's saying that. In fact, if I imagine you're new to this channel, because one of the things you will constantly hear me say is one of the greatest mistakes Palestinians make is that their primary means of resistance has been violent resistance, and their primary target has been civilians. So no, I think we need to hold Palestinians accountable and pressure them to engage in more peaceful forms of resistance. But I also think we need to grapple with reality as it is and understand that actions have effect. There's cause and effect. So uh, acknowledging reality is not patronizing. It's essential if we're going to make any progress here. Andy Martin asks, will Hamas execute hostages because of the successful right? This is a thought I had. Unclear, like you could see some benefit because this is a huge morale win for Israel. Um, it's a blow to Hamas and the pro-Palestine movement. That's without a doubt. So one way to really mitigate this morale boost is if Hamas would publicly execute 4 hostages, that would pretty much cancel out the morale boost, right? So you could certainly see some strategy there, but that would cost them. Like Hamas does a fair bit of effort for PR. Like they want to be seen as the good guys. So executing hostages will not be a good PR move. So it's not a clear. It's probably not a clear decision for them. Um, and yeah, I think that is probably the gist of it. One more thing. We did talk about the hostage deal and the complicated nature of it. And I really, something clicked yesterday, and it really shows how like the Western media spins certain narratives. Well, not only the Western media, but here's a clear example. So you may have seen in the news, Hamas rejects ceasefire deal. Hamas rejects ceasefire deal. There's this idea that they've rejected multiple deals, but that's really deceitful framing. Um, it's true that they have rejected every single deal that calls for them to release hostages without an end to the war. That's true. But Israel has rejected every deal that calls to release hostages for ending the war. So Israel and Hamas have actually rejected the same amount of deals. They're standing on certain values that are very important to them, and they're not really budging on them. So this whole framing that Hamas keeps rejecting deals, that's not really honest framing. They're both rejecting the deals based on different terms. So it just goes to show how you know uh, how it's hard to trust the media and what they're telling us. Let's see. Is there anything else? Oh, so this is kind of crazy, but I I use ChatGPT a lot for research, right? It's a great tool to help create logic out of things and connect dots. Um, I've been doing a deep dive into better understanding anti-Semitism and its causes. I'm gonna I'm gonna do more conversations with anti-Semites. I've actually understood it to such a deep level that I've even become sympathetic to them. Again, let me be clear. I think that they were wrong in the conclusions that they reached, but I understand, given reality, and given our the disproportionate power Jews have in many industries, I can understand how a person can reach the conclusion that there's a problem with Jews. Again, this doesn't mean it's okay or justified, but this deep dive has helped me better understand where they're coming from. And I think if we have any hope at building bridges between those who are in opposition to us, the first step is to fully understand who they are and why they are the way they are. Um, so yeah, why was I saying ChatGPT? So I use ChatGPT for all sorts of research. So I was just trying to get a few basic facts straight for today, and I asked them what are the names of the four hostages that were rescued in Gaza. And again, I could go to some article and find it, but this will produce it in a second. And then it literally goes I mean, let me screen share this. This is crazy. Okay, this is bonkers. Hold on. Why is my screen share giving me problems right now? Whatever. Okay. Let's um let's just read it. The four hostages rescued in Gaza yesterday were taken from the Nova Music Festival. That is true. During the attack by Hamas, their names are Talia Levy, Amit Ben Yosef, David Cohen, Yael Alon. And it clearly, I knew right away those are not the names. And it just literally just made up names. And then I go, that's not their names. It goes, the four hostages rescued in Gaza on June 8th during an Israeli operation were Ella Wiesel, Noah Shalit, Yair Weiss, and Lear Levy. So it's an amazing tool. It unlocks immense amounts of productivity, but you need to be very careful because sometimes it will just produce complete bullshit. And it's very interesting because why can't it just pull from an article? It literally says searching. It's searching the web for this answer. So I just asked it that. I just said that's not their names again, and it goes, the four hostages rescued by the IDF are Yaron Lev, Efrat Ben David, Matan Shamir, Tamar Segi. It's literally just making up names. I'm actually going to screenshot this and post this on Twitter because that's some crazy shit right there. Anyways, any final questions before we wrap it up? This one, the idea is for it to be short and sweet. We will have another stream sometime next week, but I just wanted to give some updates, some analysis. Okay, well, to sum it up, I personally think if we could bring the hostages back, we should. I think the chance of us defeating Hamas are quite low. And in attempting to continue to weaken them, we will only risk the chance of more hostages being killed in captivity. So the surest way to reduce suffering is to get this deal, end the war. And so real quick on this note. So people are struggling with the idea of Hamas remaining in power. I get that. I really do. But we need to be realistic, okay? So I don't think we can defeat them the same way the US can defeat the Taliban. What we can do is we can occupy Gaza and keep them weak, right? We could keep them to be an insurgency group. The second we leave Gaza, they will rise to power again. So we could occupy it indefinitely, or we can find a different entity to control there, like the PA, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt. There's been all sorts of ideas. I would say that might be, a preferred solution. If we can put in a different government, a more moderate government, if we could successfully do that, I think that very well might make this whole thing worth it, as tragic as it's been. But Israel has not proven to be able to successfully occupy territories and create good living conditions there. We've controlled the West Bank for over 50 years, and the Palestinian population have been continuously radicalized. They're more radical than ever before. Um, so we haven't really shown that we can control a territory and create hospitable conditions for peace. So I don't have a high degree of confidence in us successfully doing that. And because I don't have a high degree of confidence in us successfully doing that, it's very hard for me to come to terms with the fact that we won't release the hostages. We'll let them die in captivity. Maybe we'll rescue a few more. It's certainly possible. Um, but to give up on the hostages for an outcome that is very uncertain is hard to come to terms with. So that's why I support doing the sure thing. Now, doing the sure thing means Hamas remains in power. What is that? So now what, right? Do we just have another situation like this in a few years? Well, hopefully not. So, what can we actually do about Hamas? And this is controversial, but I think that we should actually engage in diplomacy with Hamas, right? Sounds like a radical position, but there are countless other examples throughout history of terror organizations who have become more moderate and legitimate governments. In fact, we have seen Hamas become more moderate, at least in their charter, throughout the decades. Um, we also are seeing a shift in the Middle East, right? Who would have thought 10 years ago that that Israelis can go to UAE and be safer than they are in New York these days, or go to Morocco, right, or Bahrain? Who would have thought that we could normalize ties with Saudi Arabia? So as we're building a stronger coalition with Gulf nations, we could work with these Gulf nations and the international community to pressure Hamas into making certain concessions and becoming more moderate. Um, I don't think they're I think generally speaking, ideology is not as deep rooted as it's presented. I think it's possible to get people to shift in their opinions easier than many think. Um, and it's also worth noting when Hamas was elected to power in 2006, they reached out to Israel for a 10-year truce. Few people know this. And there were some unfavorable terms. It was recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine, have some right of return. There were some demands and said 10 years of peace for this. Now, Israel, what I think Israel should have done, we shouldn't have agreed just, you know, as it is, but we should have negotiated and tried to find a middle ground and try to get this 10-year truce. Because 10 years of calm, it very well may be the case that no one is interested in going back to war after you have a 10-year truce. And you would have further negotiated a longer truce. Maybe both sides would make more concessions. But Israel responded by saying, we don't negotiate with terrorists. We're not gonna engage you on this truce. And they ultimately decided to blockade Gaza, which Israel themselves have viewed blockades in the past as an act of war. When Egypt blockaded the Suez Canal, we viewed that as an act of aggression. So our response to Hamas's attempt at a 10-year truce was to blockade Gaza. And again, it's unclear that this negotiation would have been fruitful. It's impossible to know, but to not even attempt, I think, is a grave mistake. So they agreed to a 10-year truce in the past. I think there's a high likelihood they can agree again, and I think there's a path to diplomacy. And you need to think that if we could solve this diplomatically, then we save so much future suffering for all our people. Um, we also, I think it's important now to understand that there's this idea of invincibility in Israeli society, that we're so powerful nobody could defeat us. I think that the past 8 months, if I'm really trying to come out of it, and one positive outcome is that Israelis, in a sense, are humbled and understand that living by the sword is no way to live, and that there's no guarantee that we can continue to exist on this land without peace. Right now in the north, you have hundreds of thousands of civilians, Israeli civilians, who have left their homes because of rocket fire from Hezbollah. Israel does not have the capabilities to fight Hezbollah because we're tied up in Gaza. So right now we're seeing that Israel does not have the capacity to fight on two simultaneous fronts. Well, there's potential scenarios down the line where there's many more fronts, right? This is just, we're talking about Hezbollah and Gaza. There's some escalation in the West Bank, but imagine a full-blown intifada in the West Bank, full-blown engagement with Hamas, full-blown war with Hezbollah, and we're nowhere near there. They have 150,000 um, technically advanced rockets pointed at Israel. What if Syria joins in? What if Iran joins in? You very well could have a situation where life in Israel is miserable because there's daily rocket fire that could be sustained for years without Israel being able to mitigate it. What will happen then is tourism will plummet to nearly zero. The economy will take a massive hit. Um, People will stop investing in Israeli companies. And those who contribute the most to the Israeli economy are the most likely to leave because they have the resources to do so, and their businesses are generally, being greatly affected by this. So you could see um, a drain of the individuals that contribute most to the innovation and the economy, while tourism goes down to zero, and while life in Israel becomes quite miserable. Um, this is a possibility, and the only solution, there's no military solution unless we want to just kill everybody, right? Like nuke the entire Middle East. But that shouldn't even be considered an option. There is no better security than peace. We need to engage in the peace process. We need to understand, if we want Israel to remain to exist and to be a place where Jews can live safely and thrive, peace is the only way to do it. So if some good comes out of the horrors of the past 8 months, hopefully one of them is that Israelis are humbled and understand that we cannot continue to live by the sword, and that we need to be engaging actively in the peace process. Let's see. We have a few more questions. Elemental Tomago: does Israel shifting from the Hannibal directive to rescuing hostages indicate an internal shakeup within IDF leadership, or have I misunderstood something? Yeah, I think there's a slight misunderstanding here. The Hannibal directive doesn't say we don't attempt to rescue hostages in captivity. It says that if a hostage is being captured, that the Hannibal directive is to just kill everybody involved, including the hostage. Um, so the Hannibal directive, the idea is to avoid hostages being captured in the first place, right? So, for example, let's say you see a hostage being taken into a building, blow up the building. That's the Hannibal directive, which is quite controversial. Um, but it doesn't say that if we have intel on where a hostage is being held, that we should not rescue them. So I think that's what's happening. Um, Akram again says, "Thank you so much for providing commentary. My pleasure. Just doing what I can." So Shachar saying, you're saying there's no connection between Hannibal directive and operations to release hostages. Hannibal directive is greatly misperceived and mostly mythical. Well, I wouldn't agree that it's mostly mythical. I mean, a lot of the people who died on October 7th died because of the Hannibal directive. Israel admitted to shooting Hellfire missiles from helicopters at anybody crossing back into the border. Um, and this is, we spoke about bodies that were incinerated. Most of them were incinerated from this Hellfire missile. There were thousands of Hamas and members and other Palestinian militants crossing back into Gaza. A lot of them had hostages with them, and they were just shooting at everybody. We know this happened, and it's interesting. There's an admission by Israel that kind of shines light on this. If y'all recall, after October 7th, the number of casualties was 1,400, or killed was 1,400. They revised the number to 1,200. The reason they gave for the revision, and again, maybe they're not honest about this, but the publicly stated reason for the revision was there were 200 bodies that were we thought were Israelis, but we identified them as Hamas. They were so badly burnt, it took us months to identify them. Well, how do they get burnt, right? They didn't burn. You often hear that Hamas did all this burning, but there's actually not much evidence that they were burning people alive. Um, the burnt bodies were primarily from Hellfire missiles. And that is the Hannibal directive in action. Noah Maxwell says, do you believe that the extreme force used while rescuing hostages will cause Gazans to turn on Hamas if Gazans fear Israel more than Hamas? No, no, I think history tells us this isn't what happens. The harder we hit, there's this idea, that if we hit them hard enough, eventually they'll understand that Hamas is the bad guy because they brought them in this situation. But the harder we hit them, the more they see Hamas as the protector. After every Gaza operation, public sentiment for Hamas increases, not decreases. This is pretty consistent for all operations we've done there. So I don't think it would move the needle. So someone says, do we know what's been confirmed about that, though? I don't think there's been confirmation about large number of hostages being killed by IDF, other than certain accounts on Twitter with agendas. Yeah, I mean, Israel's not going to admit to this, right? But we do know that there were two separate actions they took, which certainly killed civilians. One was the Hellfire missiles being shot on everybody returning into Gaza, and again, you had hundreds of incinerated bodies. This was from the Hellfire missile, and then we know in Kibbutz Be'eri, and I think in at least one other kibbutz, they shot tank fire into houses that had hostages in it. The rationale for this is there was a lot of chaos. They were spread very thin, and now you're in Be'eri. There's a house where there's terrorists in there holding hostages. You can now have this prolonged, many hour long hostage situation where there's no guarantee that you'll get them back alive. And then your resources are going towards this prolonged operation. Because they were spread thin, they took a rationale. They said, look, we need to free up our tanks and our militants. We don't have time for a prolonged hostage situation. We're just going to blow up the building. And that is what happened. The buildings that were destroyed and burnt in Be'eri and other kibbutzim, most of them was from tank fire. Again, the IDF isn't going to tell you numbers. They're not going to talk about a lot of this stuff. But we do know that the Hellfire missiles were shot, and we do know the tanks were shot in the kibbutzim. This we do know to be true. Daba 23, Adar, don't we know what happens when Israel releases prisoners? Sinwar was released in Gilad Shalit deal, and it led to October 7th, so it's not speculation. To some extent, yeah, we do. What we do know is that of those released, some will get back into terrorist activity. But what we don't know, and this is what is speculative, is what will actually be the impact of that. So yeah, Sinwar was released in Gilad Shalit deal. It's unclear, though, that October 7th only happened because Sinwar was released. It very well may have happened regardless. Again, so there's a level of speculation as to what the actual impact of the release is. But when it comes to October 7th was not a Hamas victory as much as it was an Israeli failure. This was a major failure on our part to secure our borders. We had one brigade there. Um, Days before October 7th, we moved two brigades into the West Bank, despite there being multiple warnings from intelligence units that there's going to be an attack. Uh, it wasn't, I don't even think it was an intelligence blunder as much as it was a military blunder. The Shin Bet had warnings of this. Egyptian intelligence also gave warnings of this. U.S. intelligence also gave warnings of this. You had the Tatzpitaniot. They are, what does that translate to? That's the unit that views the cameras on the border. They were warning military personnel, their commanders, for weeks that there's unusual activity on the border. So there were many signs, and we neglected to do something about it. So if we don't want another October 7th to happen, a lot of it really just comes down to having actually good security on the border. It was a major failure on our part. It is avoidable. You need multiple brigades there. You need to take security warnings and intelligence warnings very seriously. Um, and we didn't do that. We didn't do that. And some will speculate that we let it happen because there's some political gain. It's possible that some people knew about it and they saw benefit to turning a blind eye, but eh, conspiracies that require a lot of people to be involved are less likely to be true. And there's a lot of different moving parts in the army. So it seems more like negligence than it was intentional, just based on the sheer amount of people that would need to be involved in order to pull something something like this off. Johan Bijou says Gadi Eisenkot resigned from government. Yes, so this actually is breaking news. Gantz and Eisenkot both resigned. Um, I saw this the moment before going live, so I don't know exactly. Here, let's actually do a live coverage of this. Let's see. Give me a good article on this. Gantz quits. I'm on Times of Israel. Somebody has a good. Netanyahu asked National Unity leader not to abandon campaign as Ben-Gvir jockeys for power in wake of shakeup. IDF concerns hostages were killed by Hamas civil bureaucrat. No, they're not giving a full thing on this situation. But yeah, does this mean we're going to elections? Let's see. Okay. This is Ynet, which is really more a right-leaning news site, but they do some good reporting. Benny Gantz said on Sunday that he was leaving the war cabinet after joining it 5 days after the October 7th massacre to support the war effort. He called for elections and a national commission of inquiry into the failing leadership leading up and on the fateful day. Like many Israeli patriots, my party and I showed up, although we knew this was a bad government. Gantz said, referring to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's far right and religious coalition. We did it because this was a bad government, right? So he joined in order to it's a bad government, so he wanted to be able to make it better. That's his rationale. In a press conference, Gantz said that the emergency cabinet that was formed was out of shared fate and not political partnership. Months after the disaster, the situation in Israel and in the room where decisions are made has changed. Netanyahu and his partners have transformed the call for unity to an empty term in reality. Critical strategic decisions are met with hesitation, procrastination, and rejection out of political considerations. He said Netanyahu was preventing Israel from advancing to real victory. That is why we are leaving the cabinet with a heavy heart, but with resolve. He said, calling on elections to be held in the fall. I call on Netanyahu to agree to a date. Don't let our people be torn apart. So it's interesting. It seems like he's joining because he thinks Bibi's not being aggressive and hawkish enough. It seems like that's what's going on, which is interesting. So Gantz is very likely might be the next prime minister, and in many ways he's better than Bibi. But there are certain areas on policy where he seems to be more hawkish. So I would love to see, pretty much, I'd love to see Bibi gone. I think Gantz is preferred, but he's not some like revolutionary who's gonna achieve peace on the land. I mean, maybe, but like he doesn't seem to be that guy. But yeah, hopefully we go to elections and we could, for good, say bye to the chapter of Benjamin Netanyahu, who will be remembered as one of the worst leaders in not only Israeli history but Jewish history. That's my opinion. As a follow up, Noah asked, as a follow up, to what extent do you believe in deference through force as a useful uh, deference or deterrence through force as a useful doctrine? I think it's been, for the most part, ineffective. It's really hard to know, right? Because there's an assumption being made. I could point to the fact that acting aggressively, responding to violence with more violence has been our approach since the beginning. You hit us, we're going to hit you back harder, right? That's been our approach. It hasn't led to a great situation. It's led to international isolation. It's led to Palestinians being more radical than ever before, um, right? So it doesn't seem like it's working. But then one can say, well, you don't know how bad the situation would be if we didn't take this approach. I personally believe that uh, we need to put a much more emphasis on diplomacy and on creating conditions that are hospitable for peace. So what does this really mean? Nobody is born hateful. You're not born hating. Palestinians are not born hating Israelis. It is their environmental conditions which makes them who they are. These environmental conditions can be their teachings in school, their politicians and their parents, but it's also their day-to-day experience. So, for example, you go to school, you're taught bad things about Israelis. Those teachings are very much reinforced day to day by your interactions with Israelis. If you're living in the West Bank, the Israelis you're interacting with are settlers or soldiers. Generally, neither of those populations treat Palestinians with dignity and respect. So your teachings are being reaffirmed day after day by real life experience. If you're in Gaza, your only experience with Israelis are bombs that they're dropping on you. Um, Israel has a lot of control over the environment that Palestinians are living in, and we make a very little effort to create environmental conditions which will have Palestinians growing up as those who are open to peace with Israelis. So this is the approach we need to be taking, creating environmental conditions which will create populations. And again, also means creating environmental conditions within Israel that will make a population oriented towards peace. This needs to be our approach because we have two populations that have immense amount of fear, mistrust, hate, and trauma from one another. And it's going to be very hard to solve the conflict if we can't begin to reconcile this. So the environment we're both living in impacts how radical we are and how we perceive the other. Wait, MG, do you think that there are politicians in Israel now who can begin to move towards peace? Yeah, I think some of the left-wing parties like Meretz and Havodah, the Labor Party, and maybe some of the Arab parties are going to be much more inclined, but they don't have much power. Hopefully, they are in the next government, so they have some sway. But you don't have a vibrant political movement of peacemakers. You do have a vibrant political movement around militarism and strength, but not about peace. Cool. I think that's it. I said I'm going to do a 20-minute stream, and here we are, 44. Oh, 4444, just as I said that. Um, Thank you all for tuning in. I will be back in a few days with some more content. Stay tuned. Stay safe. Sending you all love.